Welcome to the Diverse Minds podcast, where we give you the tips, tools, and techniques you need to be a mentally healthy and inclusive leader. Each week, you'll hear about a variety of topics linked to mental health, well-being, and diversity that will enhance both your professional practice and personal well-being. Welcome to the 193rd episode of the award-winning Diverse Minds podcast, and welcome to May. And this month's theme is all about anxiety linked to the climate crisis. But before we carry on with today's show, I just wanted to ask you, have you watched my TEDx talk about the connection between culture, race, and mental health? If not, it's something you can watch in your break, as it's just 12 minutes long, and the link is in the show notes, but I'll also give it to you here. It's bit.ly/TEDx Wolves, that's WOLVES, capital L, capital O. I really hope you enjoy it because it was a labor of love. And if you did enjoy it, please leave a positive comment on YouTube, share, and like. Okay, back to the episode. So 15th to the 22nd of May is Mental Health Awareness Week, and this year's theme is anxiety. And as per the Mental Health Foundation's website, anxiety is one of the most common mental health problems we can face. And in fact, in a recent mental health survey they carried out around stress, anxiety, and hopelessness over personal finances, the Mental Health Foundation found a quarter of adults said they felt so anxious that it had stopped them from doing the things they want to do all of the time. And in fact, 6 in 10 adults feel this way at least some of the time. Now, there's no doubt that most of us have experienced anxiety at some point in our lives. It's a normal emotion. It keeps us safe. But it got me thinking about the things we can't control, choose to ignore, and also are impacted by. And of course, the climate fits into this, especially as the climate crisis, chaos, and justice is affecting global majority communities and the global South disproportionately. We know that over the past century that human activity has increased greenhouse gases. If we think about industrialization, the way in which we are mining for minerals and things like, and that includes energy at unprecedented rates, and mainly due to the burning of fossil fuels such as natural gas, petroleum, and coal. What's happened is we've seen rising temperatures. And I've used the UN's definition of climate crisis, which can be defined as rising temperatures which are fueling environmental degradation, natural disasters, weather extremes, food and water insecurity, economic disruption, conflict, and terrorism. Sea levels are rising, the Arctic is melting, coral reefs are dying, oceans are acidifying, and forests are burning. In fact, the last 4 years were the hottest on record. And according to a September 2019 World Meteorological Organization report, that's WMO, we are at least 1 degree Celsius above pre-industrial levels and close to what scientists warn would be, quote unquote, an unacceptable risk. Now, climate change is in fact a risk multiplier that makes worse already existing changes. So there's often pushback, isn't there, from certain groups that say, oh, it's just weather, this isn't a big deal. But the rate of change and the acceleration, of course, there's been ice ages, there's always been weather patterns, but this acceleration and the heating is incredibly dangerous. So the droughts we see in the continent of Africa and in fact parts of China and Latin America directly feed into political unrest and violence. And the World Bank estimates that in the absence of action, more than 140 million people in sub-Saharan Africa, parts of Latin America, and South Asia will be forced to migrate within their regions by 2050. And in fact, the way things are going, this is anecdotal, this is not me as a scientist, but it feels like that's going to come a lot sooner if we think about the temperatures that were seen last summer in Pakistan, in particular, in Lahore and Karachi, and in Iraq, 49 degrees centigrade. That is terrifying. So of course, as I use the word terrifying, it does feel beyond terrifying. And if any human life is at risk, it does impact all of us actually. So how is climate anxiety defined? It is this feeling of existential dread. And it's been defined by the American Psychological Association as, quote, the chronic fear of environmental doom. So in addition to these feelings of anxiety or worry, emerging research has also linked climate anxiety to a plethora of negative mental health outcomes. Like we talk about mental ill health more broadly, and these will include stress, of course, depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, particularly if people have had to flee from natural disasters, potentially substance abuse, panic attacks, irritability, insomnia, grief, anger, social withdrawal, and even suicidal ideation. And this is from a report, The Psychology of Climate Change, the British journal Psych Bulletin, 45 brackets 4, published in 2021 by J. Dodds. And there is a link in the show notes. So, workers in many parts of the world are already experiencing a serious climate crisis, and they are seriously impacted by the direct consequences of this. We know that working lives are becoming increasingly difficult as people's job expose them to significant health and safety risks, such as heat waves, flooding, maybe having to, mining, being exposed to certain chemicals, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. And I'm mentioning chemicals because I'm thinking about countries where there isn't as much choice or that there's no real discussion about it, and that could be anywhere in the globe. But of course, the climate emergency will keep going. And we know that most workplaces around the world are going to be impacted. And so, we as global employers, and you do see this trend where people in the global north, if they work in offices in the global north, are looked after much better than employees working in the global south. So, there is a responsibility if we think about equality, if people are really serious about equality, inclusion, and belonging. Addressing climate emergency and crisis head on is really, really important. And I've included the link in the show notes, but there's a great briefing, and it's from a few years ago. It's still incredibly relevant, called Climate Change in the Workplace by Freshfields, Bruckhaus, Derringer. And it's really, really helpful to think about all the elements. So please do use that resource if you think it would be useful to you. So climate change, it makes sense. Actually, I should stop saying change. It's not change, we're actually in crisis. Will damage economies, devastate populations, and we've already seen some resource scarcity, and dramatically increase the cost of doing business. So we could look at the humanitarian side if that's our values, but there are also lots of business reasons. And it's really important that companies of all sizes can take action. And we know that it's often very easy for small companies to take action. So it's really easy for someone like me as a one-woman show to take action. Now, I'm pretty carbon neutral. I always travel by train. I walk to my office by foot because it's only 5 or 10 minutes. But of course, I have my computer on for a lot of the day. I turn it off. I make sure my lights are off if I leave the space. We do have for the office block and building, we do talk about the energy. We do think about the green energy. But for me, it's very easy to make changes. I know that certain companies are going to find that more difficult, or there might be resistance, and sometimes there are things going on behind the scenes that we don't know about. But interestingly, a study published in September 2022 in the Lancet Planetary Health, which was led by Climate Cares, a collaboration between the Institute of Global Health Institute and the Grantham Institute, both at Imperial College London. Now, this extensive survey was conducted by a panel of researchers with relevant experience in environmental psychology, really interesting that is a field, public health, mental health, neuroscience, environmental science, and science communication backgrounds. And it also had the input of a young person's advisory group. And researchers found that while young people reported disruption and concern for their future due to both issues of climate change and COVID-19, that climate change was associated with a greater distress overall, especially in young people with low levels of generalized anxiety. So perhaps not what we might assume, that if you have anxiety, climate crisis is going to add to that. When people have low levels of what is considered generalized anxiety, they're still experiencing great distress, in the UK about climate crisis. So they surveyed over 500 people aged 16 to 24 in the UK from August to October 2020. And the study asked young people about their thoughts and feelings around climate change and the global pandemic, as well as the range of impacts on their life, their sense of agency to respond to each crisis, and their mental health and well-being. And this piece of research actually is the first piece of research to explore and compare these two pressing global crises on young people's mental health. So really, really important. And of course, the link is in the show notes. And the researchers found that the pandemic was more associated with feelings of isolation, loss, and grief for young people in the UK, while climate change was associated more with anger, disgust, guilt, and shame. And Dr. Emma Lawrence, from Mental Health Innovations Fellow and lead at Climate Cares, said, quote, even in the height of the COVID-19 pandemic in the UK, young people were at least as concerned about the climate crisis. Our study emphasizes the importance of leaders taking urgent action on the climate emergency and doing so in a way that meaningfully listens to the concerns and desires of young people. Climate education and mental health support, for example, must help young people cope with the compounding stresses they face while enabling appropriate opportunities for action. And I mention this because you might think, well, young people, actually 16 to 24 is quite a broad spectrum. We know that some people will go into work quite early. These are people in our workforce. These are people that really care. This is a generation that has had to deal very visibly, particularly in the global north, with climate change on their doorstep far more than my generation, for example. So I really hope you're enjoying the content of this podcast. And if you want to keep up to date with my work, then why not join my bi-monthly newsletter? When you join, you'll receive a copy of my ebook, a free copy of my ebook, The Mentally Healthy Leading Manager. And to join, the link is bit.ly/DMMCHSU. And the link, of course, is in the show notes. Okay, so what can and should workplaces do about the climate crisis and the anxiety that goes with it? Please remember that no region in the world is untouched by the risk of disaster, leaving pretty much everyone vulnerable to the threat of climate change, its feelings, their sense of loss, worrying about friends, family members, and colleagues around the world. And we know that, of course, this is then going to have an impact, a negative impact on mental health and well-being. And let's not forget the fires in London in summer 2022 from the extreme heat. We get flooding pretty much every year. Those, awful flooding in Tewkesbury is at the front of my mind when I say that. And in Wales, the horrible images. And I remember watching the news and this poor family, an elderly couple, and they both had disabilities and they were crawling on their hands and knees and they couldn't get downstairs in their home. So this is absolutely on our doorstep. And it's not a bolt on. I see this when people very similarly talk about health and safety and equality, diversity and inclusion, sustainability in the environment. It's like, it's there, it's going to cost you money, but it's not on our doorstep now, so why bother? It's really integral to every decision that is being made in the workplace. And we have, to quote Asian Dove Foundation, one of my favorite bands, to be conscious in everything that we do. So firstly, talk about this. Talk about climate crisis, climate justice, climate chaos, and find out how your staff are doing. Acknowledge that it's happening. Not talking about it won't make it go away or make it disappear. And equally, talking about it won't make it worse. And James Sussex, a clinical team lead at Workplace Options, states, talk about this dread, this fear, and this anxiety. Because if you give it airtime, it reduces the size of the problem. And of course, this is a massive problem that we're all facing. But carrying on as if nothing is happening is not the solution. There are a number of organisations that run climate change workshops in the UK and beyond. And indeed, a really great resource is TEDx London's Climate Curious podcast. They have guests from all over the world, based in the UK, outside of the UK, and they have really, really great conversations. And that link is in the show note, but do check it out. TEDx London's Climate Curious podcast, at least to get you thinking. So if you want to run something akin to a book group, you can have a listening group and then talk about the episodes and see what you can do within your workplace. The second thing is to find out what B Corps are doing. So we have tons of examples. So what is a B Corp? So a certified B Corp is a for-profit corporation that has been certified by B Lab, which is a non-profit company that measures a company's social and environmental performance against the standards in the online B Impact Assessment. Okay, so not everyone can be a B Corp. Not everyone aspires to being a B Corp, but we have lots of examples. They tend to be smaller businesses, but not exclusively. But it's really worth having a look at what they do at their websites. If you type in UK B Corps, you will get some ideas and you can have a look at the supply chains and procurement power, how they're doing things. It will give you ideas to shift the status quo. You might even want to partner up with them if you're a bigger organization. If you're a smaller organization, I think some of them do mentoring. Don't quote me on that, but have a look. And this will probably also involve looking at your carbon footprint, so you have a benchmark to know where you need to improve and to set targets, which leads me to my third point, which is push for an environmental audit. Maybe you already have them, maybe they're in place, but how widely is it shared within an organization? How do people know about it? Everyone should really be aware of this. So an environmental audit evaluates a company's environmental performance, much like it says on the tin, and they can be done on specific procedures and operational areas to assess effectiveness and compliance with environmental rules and regulations. But you can also get them to be best practice. It's a bit like equality impact assessments. You do them, they're not legal anymore, but you do them to look at a particular policy, procedure, or practice. You don't, particularly when it's new, but it's really good to use it to review them. And you can do it in an anticipatory fashion. You could do it in a reaction, which, isn't really what I would say to do. But environmental audit is exactly the same. So they're in place to ensure companies do what they can to preserve the environment. And the audits will aim to control a company's environmental practices and ensure compliance with the different regulations that may apply. So an environmental audit very broadly will aim to identify which environmental management practices practices are working effectively, to find different areas of improvement when it comes to environmental compliance, and assess any new and potential risks to the environment. So really important to do. And, if you're a smaller organization, it might be that you could partner up with a charity, or, is there some pro bono opportunities, particularly for SMEs, that would be worth doing. The fourth one is about clean energy. I know clean energy is technically not the cheapest, but there might be grants for your sector. I don't know the ins and outs of applying for business grants, actually, because that's not something I really get to do. But who in your organization is responsible? Can your local economic partnership, if you're a small organization, help you? Where can you go for sources of support? And if your building is part of an estate holding company and maybe you don't have the capacity to change the energy, lobby, and how you can do that. And it's worth doing it senior leader to senior leader often. So how can that be put on the agenda? So think about that. A fifth area is pension and investments. This is a huge, huge area. It's absolutely crucial. And we know money talks. It's often not rocket science and can definitely be done. There's been a huge increase of green funds on the market, but there's also to be very wary of greenwashing, which is saying, oh, this is an ethical fund when it isn't. So how do you carry out that due diligence? If there aren't super sensitivities around it, or can your audit company, again, if you're a big organization and you're audited each year, do they have a function? Can someone help you with that to look at the green funds? That's another way around it. There's lots more information out there. But of course, if people's pensions it will be in investments, it's really important that people can have some flexibility around that and also know where their money is being invested. The sixth area is around support sustainable transport, trains, which I know can be tricky, bike schemes, public transport, working from home. And I also appreciate that many people have mobility impairments and they can't travel. The travel in this country isn't super accessible. So adjustments, and looking again, you could look at thinking about procurement power if you're purchasing any assistive technology or equipment for people. Can you also buy it from companies that are particularly ethical, or ask them those questions? Flying should really be the last option, and it doesn't really need to be done now with video technology. Again, I know servers have to be on if you're in a building, that it's not completely carbon neutral. I appreciate that, but it is much better than flying. I think, even if you have to attend a conference on all day via video conference, that's still better than flying, but it's not completely carbon neutral, because actually even sending an email has a carbon element attached to it, sending text to. And this is a problem, isn't it? And if you check out episode From Awareness to Acceptance to Action with Martin Griffin, he's a geologist and he supports waste management, and he talks about the waste that comes from creating one mobile phone. So none of it's carbon neutral, but it is better. And perhaps having conversations about that as well. If you give your staff phones, can you work with a company that does refurbished phones, refurbished laptops, refurbished iPads, etc.? That's really, really important. Increase recycling. So it kind of builds on what I said. And some people really hate this, don't they? Some people feel really disgruntled and irritated, not just with recycling, with everything. But one of the tips is to make it a game, make it fun, make it a competition. Which team can recycle the most? Can you have swap shops? People can bring in clothes, people can bring in items that they no longer need. Bartering. We don't really do bartering anymore, but it's a really key part of the human evolution and experience and civilization. And so all of those things, how we think about recycling. Yes, it's putting plastic in the right bin or reducing plastic. It's also about, recycling cans, but it can be things like how we recycle our clothes, visible mending workshops. People can bring stuff in. You can do that over lunchtime. You can have someone in. This is a holistic approach. And, things like mending, this was the way of life. People couldn't afford to keep buying new clothes. There weren't clothes shops on tap. So if we think about the 16th century, even the 18th century, early 20th century. So these are things that are definitely in the human consciousness. Let's just bring them back in. And then finally, link with community groups, charities. So it could be you have a nominated charity each year. Can you think about an environmental charity or a charity that's doing urban regeneration in your area? Talk to community groups, funding community groups, if it's within your organization's acceptable policies, really supporting local things. So it can be national environmental charities, absolutely, but there's so much power in community groups and deciding on that and being very genuine about it. And it can be a reciprocal, it can be a two-way process, as long as both sides agree and it's done with real value and heart. I think that's really, really important. So we all know that we are in crisis of climate chaos. We've got massive issues and challenges with climate justice as well. And we all have to do something about it. Perhaps you're not a decision maker in your organization, but we're not powerless. And if you think that we are, or if you think, come on, Layla, you're talking rubbish, please go and listen to Donna Patterson's episode about ensuring people's rights at work. That's episode 189, how she took her employer to work, represented herself and won. Not about sustainability, but it's a very inspirational episode. Join your sustainability network. If you don't have one, can you set one up? Can you get support for that? And I really would love, if you're a senior leader and listening to this, how are you going to respond to this? Some of the points I've made. So I really hope you've enjoyed this episode. Please do join me next week where I'm speaking to Jelly May Moring from Parents for Future to talk about safeguarding the future in terms of the climate for children of the world. And if you enjoyed this episode, please leave me a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcast from. Until then, take care. I love to hear from you. So I hope to connect with you soon. Take care, everyone.
Thanks for listening to the Diverse Minds podcast. Don't forget to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you access your podcasts from. You can also connect with me on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. Tune into next week's episode of the podcast, where I'll bring you more insights on mental health and inclusion. Bye for now.